Hello everyone and welcome to Rebel Way. My name is Andrew Sutherland and today we're going to be rendering explosions in Karma. So I've got an explosion already created, and if we put down a geometry node and we dive into this file, I can paste that location here. So let's zoom out a bit. Let's move down the timeline a bit. Let's create a camera by clicking on this camera. Let's create a distant light and make sure that we've got this locked so we can move our camera and light around. So I just want to position this up as if we were the sun. And let's go back to the camera. And cool. Let's just call this explosion. Dive back inside. And we're going to create a shader for this using the Pyrobake tool. So I'm going to type Pyrobake volume. Plug this in. And the first thing we're going to do, we're going to click on Initialize Edge Scattering. And we're going to come down to the scatter, click Compute Range. Let's increase our density to 4. I'm going to click D on my keyboard, change the background to dark. Let's click on ramp, use ramp here. As you can see, this looks pretty low res, but it's actually a decent resolution simulation. So under max vis, let's click this on, make this 350. And I think we're still being limited by our overall settings. So I'm going to click D on the keyboard again, come over to texture, and let's set the limit to 350 here. 350. 350. Let's tick off and back to refresh our. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. Let's click on. Let's change this to 16. Once again, refresh our viewport. And that's looking much better. Okay, so let's work with this. And we come back to our Pyrobake. Come back to the scatter. Under blur, let's increase this to 20. Blur iterations, let's try something like 3. Let's come to our masking. Set this to 0.1. Let's bring this, bring this back to 1. Blur iterations to 3. Let's set this max mark to 95. And that's looking pretty good. So let's work with these settings for now. And let's put down a null. Call this out explosion. I'm going to copy this null. We come over to stage. We're going to type SOP import. I'm going to paste that in there. We're going to import cameras. We're going to come over to this build view and we're going to change this to Solaris. We're going to look through camera 1 and we're going to change this to calmer. Now we don't have a shader on this yet. Let's also make sure our background is black. So let's go back to our explosion, and on the pyro bake node we'll come to quick setups and create a material, and we're going to choose a custom location. And before we do that, let's actually jump back to stage. Let's create a material library, connect that back to object. So we're going to come to the pyro bake node, and we're going to click on create material and click on custom location, and on the stage we're going to click on material library and click accept. And if we jump back to stage, we should have our shader here. So let's create an assign material. Enable that, and we're going to, let's actually first call this explosion. We're going to drag this explosion up here, and under materials we're going to put that there and change this to calmer. Background to black. And as you can see, we now have our shader working. So next up, let's create a SOP create. And let's just create a grid, and this is going to be our ground. Let's increase the size. Something like that. Let's call this ground. Merge. Now we have this explosion. Let's create a light here in stage. I'm going to put down a distant light like we did before. And if we look through the distant light, something like that. Jump back to our camera. Let's make this orangey. Something like that. We can always lower the intensity. Jumping back to object, I've also got a city that I've created. So I'm just going to quickly import this here. I've got the link saved here. I'm just going to put down a null. Call this out city. Jumping back to stage. We're going to do another SOP import. And now we have our city. Let's just move our camera around. So make sure we've got this locked on. And let's frame up our city. Something like that. Dive back to stage. Make sure we're looking through our camera. And that looks pretty cool. We're just going to create a principal shader. I usually like to just set this to some like Lumo color just to check it first. And we're going to go to assign materials. We're going to create a new assign material. We're going to call this city. We assign our city and our principal shader, and we can see it's working. Let's create another one for the ground. Cool. So we've got a shader for our objects and we've got a shader for our explosion. Next thing I want to do is I want to create a fog in the scene. So jumping back to geometry, and I'm going to come to my explosion. I'm going to create a bound. And it's going to make a box around our explosion. I'm going to put a time shift node, because without this time shift node, this box is going to change, and I don't want that to happen. So I'm just going to time freeze this by coming here and clicking delete channels, and so now it's going to remain the size it is on frame 64, and I'm just going to transform this up. So let's increase the size by 10. And as you can see, that now encompasses our entire city, which is exactly what I want. And we're going to create a VDB from polygons. And I'm just going to make sure this is like a big size for now, because we want to crash our scene. We're going to change this to density and plug this in. And let's check our resolution. So our resolution is mid, I would say, lower to mid, and that's perfect for what we need. Let's copy this and call this out fog. Jumping back to stage, I'm going to copy this SOP import and paste the fog. Going to connect that to a scene. As you can see, we've now blotted out the scene. So we need to create a shader for this fog. Let's also call this fog. And under materials, we're going to create another pyro shader. And let's just lower the density to something like 0.001. Jump back and assign this to the fog. And as you can see, we're now getting some fog. Let's try and make 0.3. Cool. So you can see now, we better wait for this to render a bit, but our city is falling into, you know, it's getting foggier the further it gets back. Let's just increase these lights a bit. Let's put this back to 1. Let's create a dome light. Something like that. And then let's create a karma node. And this is where we're going to save our renders to disk. So save that wherever you want it to go. Let's lower this to something like 4. You know, you'll have to play with these settings to make sure that you're getting a decent image. It's fun. Under image output here, we're going to click on beauty. We're going to click on combine diffuse. Click on direct and indirect. Combine volume. Albedo. P for world space, depth, normal, and that should be it. And we need the normal, and we need the albedo for the denoising process, which I'll show in the advanced setup. So one other thing that you might want to do is you can put down a render geometry settings, and let's say you want to matte out this explosion. Come over to karma, and then under shading we're going to click on set or create, and then you can change this to matte. So now we've matted out our explosion, and let's say we just want to render the fog. Probably the easiest way to just do this quickly is just copy this onto each one of these. And now we're rendering just that fog. Cool, so now we're going to jump into a project file that was set up by Francesco and take a look at how he's done essentially the same thing here, but a few more custom things, and hopefully you can learn from that too. So I've got a scene here, and as you can see, we've got some buildings, we've got an explosion, we've got fog, we've got lights. And the first thing we do is we jump to this object level, and in the scene we have an explosion, and I urge you to use your own explosion. Here we're just reading in a VDB file, we're creating a pyrobake, and that's it. Although we do have a shader in stage, which I'll show in a bit. We have grid for the floor, and we have some buildings. And now we're prepping these buildings here in SOPs for USD. So we have these buildings, and as you can see, we have buildings, and we have these are going to be some neon lights that we're going to render. So we just got a bunch of these buildings. And what we're doing is we're unpacking them, we're reading in the geometry, we're unpacking them, we're creating a group for the neon lights, and here you can see we just got the body, and here we've just got the lights, and we're putting down a USD export. So USD is a file format created by Pixar, and it's an abbreviation for Universal Scene Description. So the idea behind USD is to have a file format that can be shared between artists, different departments, different studios, and that file can all be rendered with us with the same look between different programs and even different renderers. So this scene briefly touches on how we can export a geometry as a USD file, just so that we can simply load it into Stage by going here, and we can now load in that geometry, load in those lights, and we're actually doing our layout here in Stage by just transforming these buildings around and creating a scene with USD files. So we're reading in this USD file. We're going to load in your lights that are associated with that building. Here we're reading in these sort of neon tubes that you see here. And just transform those about your scene. So we're actually doing our layout here within Stage. So we have this building. We have another one here, here, there, and so forth. So we're creating that building there. From here, we've got a SOP geometry. So this time, we're not importing from Stage. We're putting down a SOP create. And what this node does is this actually allows us to jump into essentially SOPs within Stage. And here we have access to all the nodes that we do in SOPs. So, you know, in this case, we've got a grid, or a grid here. We're putting down an add node to create some points. And we're putting down an attribute randomize, and we're randomizing that p scale between 0.7 and 1.2. From there, we're also going to put down another attribute randomize, and we're going to randomize the angle. And here we have this wrangle. So I think it's best if I turn this copy to points on. So we're going to copy this grid onto these points. And as you can see, all these grids are at randomized angles, and this, if I turn this off, it becomes obvious what's happening. Here they're all sort of uniform and there's not much offset, but with this enabled, we get some randomization on the orientation. And we're going to do that when we instance our buildings in the background too. So they're not all going to line up exactly. There's going to be a little bit of offset, and that's just going to give a more organic and natural look to our city. And of course, that is all done in this SOP create node. So we can now merge it with our buildings. Now here we've just copied those buildings from here again, and we're going to put that into an instance node, and we're going to instance these buildings in the background. So if we come over to the switch over here and I turn this here, we're going to see that these buildings in the background are going to disappear. So as you can see, we've just got the switch so we can turn off the buildings in the background. And as you can see, we're using this instance node to do that instancing. So if we take these buildings, we pipe them into the second input on the instance node, and we jump inside, and here we can see we have two grids. We have an attribute randomize. We're going to create an add node to give us just the points. We're setting the Y value to 1, so these are going to sit flat, as you see, like that. We're going to give these a randomized p scale between 0.4 and 1. If we put down an attribute VOP, we're just going to create a ramp, so we can use this ramp here to control the p scale. again, we're going to randomize the angle. And once again, we're using that vex just to give our buildings some offset. So if we jump back out into stage, we just want to transform those buildings a little further back into our scene. We're putting down a null for the instance, just for organization purposes. And we have our switch, so we can turn this on and off. So if we merge that with our floor, our buildings that we have laid out in the front, and these buildings in the background, so let's enable them again when we merge them here. We now have our floor, our main buildings, and our buildings in the background. And that makes up most of our scene. And what we want to do next is we want to import our volumes. And I say volumes because we don't just have the explosion. We have our explosion, but we also have a volumetric fog. So here we've got a SOP import, and we're importing the volume. And here we're importing our explosion, and those of course come from here. So in this case, I'm just loading in an already created explosion, but create your own explosion, save it out as VDB, and import it here. So we have a pyrobake tool on our explosion here. So we have our pyrobake here, and these are our settings. We have a switch here, so we can try out using this pyrobake and not using this pyrobake, and we have this out saved as scatter, and this is what we're reading in stage. So we jump back to stage. As you can see, we're reading that null that we've named scatter. We're transforming it into place, and then we're going to merge it with our city, and here we're reading in this volume, and we're transforming the volume into place here, which is going to encompass our scene, and we're merging that together. Now we can't see it because we haven't set up our shaders, so for now I'm just going to disable this. And if we jump out here to our volume, we can see that we have a box. So what we're doing with this wrangle is we're taking this box and we're creating 3 fields. So we're gonna create 3 VDBs, and we're gonna call one red and one green and one blue. And essentially what we're doing is that we're creating a field that goes from, say this side of the box to this side of the box, and from this side of the box to that side of the box, and from here up. And if we render it in this way, we're going to have information for compositing, almost like a depth pass, but instead of just going from front to back, we can have from bottom to up, from left to right, and forward to back. So we've got full control over this fog if we render it this way when we take it to our compositing, say in Nuke. So like I mentioned earlier, we then have this VDB, and we're taking the points with the red, and we're calling that red, green, and blue. And if we right click, you can see we have density, red, green, and blue. And in our fog shader, so if we jump back to stage, we can see we have a fog here, and we're reading in that red, green, blue, and we needed to multiply the red channel with this constant. We're fitting that into a float to vector, and we putting that into the emit color. That's essentially the shader, and once we get to the comp side, hopefully this will make a lot more sense. Next thing that we were going to do is we're going to create a Rebel Way logo. So using a SOP create, once again, we're going to jump in here. And we put down a trace node. Now remember, this SOP create is like jumping into SOPs. So we're going to put down a trace node, and we're going to read in this Rebel Way logo. So we have this trace node reading in this black and white JPEG of our logo. Under filters, we've got the boundary set to black. If you have a logo with holes and faces, you might want to tick this on, but in this case we don't have any holes, so no need for that. And then we're going to put down an extrude node. We're going to make sure that we've got output back ticked on, and then we're going to transform our logo up. Jumping back to stage, we can see our logo is now there. And we're going to create some neon lights around the edges. So creating another SOP create. We're going to do the same thing we had before, the trace node. That's reading in our logo here. We're going to put down an end node so that we have this outline. We're going to put down a polywire. We're going to put down a copy, so now we have 2 of them. And we're going to transform those neon lights back up. We're going to set a color, set to this blue color, and we're going to have a null. And if we jump back to stage, we now have those neon lights surrounding our logo. And if we merge that back in with our scene, we now have our explosion, our buildings, and that logo. And if we come to the switch, this switch is just here so that we can work on just the explosion without the overhead of the city. So if I enable this switch and we switch this to input 1, now we just deal with our explosion. And if we want to bring back the city, we turn that back to input 0. So next up, we're going to put down this material library node, and in here we can put all our shaders. So here's that fog shader that we took a look at. Here's our explosion shader that's labeled incorrectly. We did use this one. And we have this neon lights. So on our geometry, we have actually put down a color node, and we've given our lights those colors. As you can see here, we've got this sort of turquoise, these are blue. And if we click on use point color, we can set the color in SOPs rather than in our shader. For our floor, we've got this cracked absols, and we're reading in some texture nodes on the base color and roughness. The logo is just a standard shader. The ground is a standard shader, and the buildings are a standard shader. I've just jumped back out to stage, and I've changed the switch to switch 1 so we can just deal with the explosion. And if I go back to my shader for the explosion in that material library 2, this is the shader that was used, and we're reading in the density, and we're fitting that density because the value seems to be from 0 to 3, and we want to deal with 0 to 1. That way we can use ramps, and the ramps will work nicely because the ramps work from 0 to 1. So we're going to put down this fit, and what we're doing here is the inverted shader trick. And what that is that we're basically computing the density from the shell towards the very center. So the center part is obviously going to have a higher density than the very edge. And what we want to do is we want to invert those values. So we're taking the density and we're fitting that with a fit range, and using these the min and max, we're inverting this density value with these values that you see here, and then that way we can isolate the shell. So the best way to kind of explain this is just if I turn this off. So we also have this scatter field, and this scatter is like a blurred version of our temperature that's all throughout this explosion, and we're multiplying that with this inverted shader technique. So if I turn this off, you can see immediately what's going to happen. We turn this multiply. There we go. And now you can see we no longer have that sort of crispy look. But if we isolate that edge of our density and we multiply it, you can see I have broken the shader. Anyways, I'm back. Just make sure you don't disable these nodes here, because if you do, you're going to lose your settings out here and you'll have to do it again. So that's essentially the shader, or the trick to the shader. But of course you can always use the pyrobake to generate your shader, like I did in the fire monster tutorial. So if you want to see how to create a shader using the pyrobake node, make sure you go and check out that tutorial. So in this tutorial here, I show how you can create a shader using the pyrobake node. So check out that tutorial. And if you come down here, we also have the standard pyrobake shader that is generated for you in the pyrobake node. So let me just show that again quickly. If you come out to your object mode and you go under the explosion, here we can see we've got the pyrobake. And if you click on quick setups, you can say click on this create material, and that's going to create a material based on the settings that you specify on this pyrobake node. And if we jump back to the stage context, next up in our network is this assign material node, and this is where we assign the materials to any of our geometry coming upstream. So as you can see here, you want to come to the scene graph. And for instance, here we've got this logo light. So you would drag that in there and come to material. And in this case, we want to assign the neon light. And here in this case, anything with the words building body, and we're going to apply the body, neon lights, neon, and so on and so forth. Of course, we've got that volume, and that's the fog, and our explosion shader, which we just took a look at. And next up, we're going to put down a render geometry setting, and this is just so that we can control some of the settings on specific things. So here we're reading in our neon lights, or anything with the word neon lights, so all of these lights that we see in our scene, and the logo light around the logo. And here we can set our number of light samples. So that's just a handy way of controlling specific things, in this case the lights. Like I mentioned earlier, this is just a switch so we can turn things on and off. In this case, we're going to keep it as is. Here we have an option for a proxy explosion. So you could create, if the explosion is a bit too heavy when you're working with placement, what you could do is you could just create a VDB of your explosion. So if we jump back to SOPs, and we come over to our explosion, we can blast everything but the density. We can VDB resample that. And if we put down this VDB node, we can convert the density into a signed distance field. We can reshape that SDF by just eroding it a bit. And we can now convert it into polygons. Of course, we can turn up the adaptivity so we can deal with less polygons. Here we're just peaking it. Sometimes this is quite useful to do something like this, because then you could render your explosion as a geometry light. And in this case, we're just using it as a proxy version. And if we got any small floating pieces like that, we can put down a delete small parts node, and that's just going to delete all those floating pieces. And then just render that out to disk. And if you need to work with the proxy of your explosion, jumping back to stage, we can load that in here. So as you can see, we now have this proxy geometry, and that can help with our layout. It's easier to move around this mesh instead of dealing with a high-res VDB. And I'm just going to switch back to our explosion. And here, I'm just going to redo this because I got something missing. But if we import cameras and we jump back here, we can simply copy this camera, jump back to stage, and we're now looking through this camera here. We come back here, and we make some adjustments. That should be respected when we come back out here. Here we're going to put down a render geometry setting so we can add some motion blur to our scene. Next up, we're going to put down this cache node and set to cache rolling windows of frames, and that's going to ensure that we've got motion blur working. I've just made a quick change and disabled the buildings in the background. So if we come up here, and these are our instance buildings that we have in the background, I'll just turn these off by turning the switch to 1. And of course we haven't gone over the lighting yet, but you should all be familiar with this. We've just got some lamps. These are our lamps set on this geometry here. You know, we've got one for each light, and we're just transforming that to be at the same place as this, and we're doing this for each one of these lights, and we're merging those all together. And here we have a dome light, and we're reading in an HDRI from HDRI Haven. So if we come over to our renders geometry settings over here, you can see we're matting everything out but our fog. Under matte, where's the matte? Yeah, under the matte. And we're just going to render this out to disk. And this is going to be our render for our fog. And as you can see, we've got these colors going from, you know, very red on this side, and this red fades off to 0 on this side, and this starts off green, and this goes all the way, you know, the green fades off here, and blue from top to bottom. And with that information, we can use, you know, the red, the green, or the blue channel in compositing and have full control over our scene, as well as a depth pass. So if we come over to this one here, you can see in this node we have our explosion and our buildings, and just like we did before there, and just like we did with the volume, we're rendering this out to disk. We also make sure we've got our beauty, we've got diffuse, we're not using reflections, we're using the direct and indirect, the volumes, the albedo, because we're going to need this for denoising, P, depth, and N. This is also very important for denoising. So I've just done a render, and I noticed that we need to set our pixel samples to something reasonable, and then we're going to render this to disk. And the last thing we want to do is change this from Solaris to build, and go to the ImageNet, change this to composite view by clicking here on composite view. Jump back in here, and under denoise we can load in our render. So let's do that now. And from there we denoise and render that out to disk as a denoised version. So a huge thank you to Francesco for setting up this scene file and creating this explosion. I hope you guys got something out of this.